The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the dusty depot in Twin Falls, Idaho territory, and Margaret Louise knew that if she didn't step off now, she'd lose her nerve entirely and end up right back where she'd started, a fate worse than death itself. She clutched her worn carpet bag to her chest as she descended the wooden steps, her boots touching the sun-baked earth of this frontier town in the summer of 1882. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, despite the dust that seemed to coat everything. It smelled like freedom, like possibility, like a chance to become someone other than the broken woman she'd been back in Philadelphia. Margaret was 23 years old and felt ancient. Her auburn hair was pinned severely beneath a plain bonnet, and her traveling dress, though once fine, had seen better days. She'd sold most of her good clothing to afford the journey west, keeping only what she needed to maintain a respectable appearance. Respectability was all she had left, and even that was a carefully constructed lie. The town of Twin Falls was smaller than she'd imagined. Though the letter from Mrs. Pemberton had promised, it was a growing community with opportunities for a woman willing to work hard. Margaret had responded to an advertisement seeking a schoolteacher, fabricating her credentials just enough to seem qualified. She could read and write beautifully, had been educated at a fine girls' academy before everything fell apart, so teaching seemed within her capabilities. What mattered most was that Twin Falls was 2,000 miles from Philadelphia, from her father's gambling debts, from the man her father had tried to sell her to in marriage to settle those debts, from the desperate act she'd committed to escape. She pushed that memory down deep where it belonged, locked away with all the other things she couldn't allow herself to think about. Here, she was simply Miss Margaret Louise, recently arrived from the East, seeking honest employment. Here, no one knew about Vincent Carlyle or the night she'd fled from the locked room where her father had left her, waiting for a man 3 times her age to come claim his prize. No one knew about the vase she'd smashed over her father's head when he tried to stop her from leaving, or whether he'd survived the blow. She'd run without looking back, taking only what money she could find in his desk drawer. The guilt threatened to surface, but Margaret forced it down. She had to survive. That was all that mattered now. The depot was a simple wooden structure, and a heavy-set man with an impressive mustache looked up from behind the counter as she approached. "Help you, miss. I'm looking for Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I'm expected." "Ah, you must be the new school teacher." The man's weathered face broke into a smile. "Welcome to Twin Falls, Miss Louise. Mrs. Pemberton's place is just down the main road there, the white house with the green shutters. Can't miss it." Margaret thanked him and stepped back into the bright afternoon sunlight. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with wooden buildings in various states of construction and wear. A general store, a saloon, what looked like a church being built at the far end of town, and various other establishments she couldn't quite make out from this distance. Cowboys and working men moved along the wooden sidewalks, and a few women in calico dresses hurried about their business. It was so different from the brick and cobblestone streets of Philadelphia that Margaret felt a moment of disorientation, as though she'd stepped into a completely different world. She supposed she had. The boarding house was easy to find, just as the depot manager had said. It was freshly painted and well-maintained, with a small garden out front that somehow survived in this arid climate. Margaret knocked on the door, her heart hammering in her chest. A plump woman in her 50s answered, her face breaking into a warm smile. "You must be Miss Louise." Come in, dear. You must be exhausted from your journey. I'm a leaner Pemberton, but everyone calls me Ellie." The kindness in the woman's voice nearly undid Margaret completely. She hadn't realized how starved she'd been for simple human warmth until this moment. She managed a smile and followed Mrs. Pemberton inside. The boarding house was clean and comfortable, with lace curtains at the windows and the smell of fresh bread coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Mrs. Pemberton led her up a narrow staircase to a small room on the second floor. It was simple but lovely, with an iron bed frame, a washstand, a small dresser, and a window that looked out over the town. "It's not much, but it's clean and the rent is reasonable," Mrs. Pemberton said. "Breakfast and dinner are included, and there's always coffee on in the morning. The necessary is out back, and there's a bathing room at the end of the hall. Saturday nights are for baths, but if you need one sooner after your travels, I can heat water for you this evening." "It's perfect," Margaret said softly, and she meant it. This little room was hers, a space where no one could lock her in, where she answered to no one but herself. It was more than perfect. It was salvation. Mrs. Pemberton patted her arm. "You settle in, dear. Dinner is at 6. There are 3 other boarders, all respectable folks. Mr. Henderson works at the bank. Miss Clara is a seamstress. And Mr. Grant is a rancher who stays in town a few nights a week when he's conducting business." After Mrs. Pemberton left, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself one moment of weakness. Silent tears ran down her cheeks, tears of relief and exhaustion and residual fear. But only for a moment. She'd learned that wallowing in emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. She wiped her eyes, unpacked her few belongings, and prepared to meet whatever came next. Dinner that evening was a revelation. The food was simple but plentiful: roasted chicken and potatoes, fresh bread and stewed tomatoes. The other boarders were polite and welcoming. Mr. Henderson was a nervous man in his 40s who spoke little. Miss Clara was younger, perhaps 30, with kind eyes and skilled hands that seemed always to be in motion, even at rest. And then there was Russell Grant. He arrived late, apologizing to Mrs. Pemberton as he took his seat across from Margaret. He was tall and lean, probably in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that was slightly too long to be properly fashionable. His eyes were an unexpected shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds, and when they met hers, Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a sensation she couldn't quite name. "Miss Louise, this is Mr. Grant," Mrs. Pemberton made the introduction. "He owns the Double R Ranch about 10 miles north of town." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Louise," Russell said, and his voice was deep and warm with an honesty to it that made Margaret want to trust him immediately. She resisted the impulse. Trust was dangerous. "Mr. Grant," she replied with a polite nod, focusing on her plate. "I hear you're the new schoolteacher," he continued. "That's good news for the town. We've been without one since Miss Patterson married and moved to Boise last spring." Margaret nodded, not quite sure what to say. She was aware of his gaze on her, steady and thoughtful, not intrusive but present. It made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite articulate. The conversation moved on to town matters, cattle prices, and the upcoming harvest social. Margaret listened more than she spoke, learning the rhythms of this new place, these new people. She noticed that Russell was well respected, that even Mr. Henderson deferred to his opinions on matters of business and town development. He had the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, something Margaret envied desperately. After dinner, Margaret excused herself and retreated to her room. She stood at the window, looking out over Twin Falls as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink she'd never seen in Philadelphia. The vastness of the landscape was almost frightening in its emptiness, but also exhilarating. Here, she could disappear. Here, she could become someone new. The next morning, Margaret met with the town council, which consisted of 5 men who seemed equally pleased and skeptical to have a young woman from the East taking on the teaching position. They showed her the schoolhouse, a simple one-room building that needed cleaning and organizing, and explained that she'd have students ranging from age 5 to 15, though the older boys often missed school during planting and harvest seasons. "We can offer you $30 a month," said Mr. Whitmore, the head of the council and owner of the general store. "It's not much, but considering your room and board are already arranged, it should be sufficient." Margaret nearly laughed. $30 was more money than she'd ever had control of in her life. Her father had never allowed her access to funds, believing women were incapable of managing finances. "That will be more than adequate, thank you." She spent the next 3 days cleaning and preparing the schoolhouse, scrubbing floors, washing windows, and organizing the meager supplies. It was hard physical work, but she welcomed it. Every tired muscle was proof that she was building something, creating a life with her own hands. On the 3rd day, as she was carrying water from the pump behind the schoolhouse, she heard the sound of horse hooves approaching. She looked up to find Russell Grant dismounting from a magnificent bay gelding. "Morning, Miss Louise," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Thought you might could use some help." Margaret straightened, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look, with her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming loose from its pins. "That's very kind, Mr. Grant, but I wouldn't want to take you away from your work." "I'm ahead of schedule at the ranch," he said easily. "Besides, my mother was a schoolteacher back in Missouri before she married my father. She always said preparing a schoolhouse was too much work for one person." Something in the way he mentioned his mother with such warmth and respect made Margaret's defenses lower slightly. "Well, if you're certain you have the time, I could use help moving the desks. Some of them are quite heavy." Russell smiled, and Margaret noticed the way it transformed his entire face, softening the weathered lines and lighting up those storm cloud eyes. "I'm certain." They worked together throughout the morning, and Margaret found herself relaxing in his presence. Russell didn't pry into her past or ask uncomfortable questions. Instead, he talked about the town, pointing out which families had children who would be her students, sharing amusing anecdotes about the community. He spoke about his ranch with obvious pride, describing the cattle operation he'd built from almost nothing over the past 6 years. "I came west when I was 21, he said as they arranged the last of the desks. "My father died, and there wasn't much left of the family farm back in Missouri. My older brother got what there was, which was his right as the eldest. I could have stayed on and worked for him, but I wanted to build something of my own, you know." Margaret did know. She knew exactly what it felt like to want something that belonged to you alone. "That was brave of you." He shrugged. "Or foolish. Depends on how you look at it. The first few years were hard, but I held on, and now the ranch is starting to turn a real profit. I've got good grazing land, a small but solid herd, and 2 ranch hands who actually know what they're doing." "You should be proud," Margaret said softly. Russell looked at her with those penetrating eyes. "I am. But I'm also lonely out there sometimes. It's a lot of space for one person." There was something in his tone, a vulnerability that matched her own hidden wounds, and Margaret felt an unexpected connection forming between them. It frightened her. She couldn't afford connections, couldn't risk anyone getting close enough to discover her secrets. She turned away, busying herself with straightening papers that didn't need straightening. "I should get back to my preparations. Thank you for your help, Mr. Grant. It was very kind of you." If Russell noticed the sudden chill in her tone, he didn't comment on it. He simply nodded, put his hat back on, and headed for the door. But he paused on the threshold, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "If you ever need anything, Miss Louise, or if you just want someone to talk to, I'm usually in town on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Mrs. Pemberton knows how to reach me otherwise." Then he was gone, leaving Margaret alone with the uncomfortable realization that she wanted to take him up on that offer, wanted to talk to him, wanted to know him better. And that was dangerous. Getting close to anyone meant risking exposure, and exposure meant losing everything she'd worked so hard to build. School began the following Monday, and Margaret threw herself into teaching with an intensity born of desperation. If she stayed busy enough, worked hard enough, maybe she could outrun the memories that chased her. She had 17 students of varying ages and abilities, and she discovered that she genuinely loved teaching. There was something deeply satisfying about watching a child's face light up with understanding, about nurturing young minds and helping them grow. The children were largely well-behaved, with the exception of Tommy Whitmore, the shopkeeper's 10-year-old son, who seemed to view school as an unnecessary interruption to his preferred activities of fishing and causing mischief. But even Tommy responded to Margaret's patient firmness, and by the end of the first week, he'd settled into the routine. The parents were welcoming, grateful to have a teacher again. Several of the mothers invited Margaret to tea or to church socials, and she accepted enough invitations to seem friendly without becoming too intimate with anyone. She was always aware of maintaining the careful facade of Miss Margaret Louise, respectable schoolteacher from Philadelphia, a woman with nothing to hide. But the facade was exhausting, and there were nights when Margaret lay in her small room at the boarding house and wondered if she would ever feel safe enough to be herself again, whoever that was. She wasn't sure she even knew anymore. Russell became a regular presence in her life, though Margaret tried to keep him at arm's length. He attended town meetings where she was present to discuss school matters. He happened to be in town on the same days she did her shopping. He showed up at church on Sundays and somehow always ended up walking in her direction afterward. He never pushed, never demanded more attention than she was willing to give, but he was there, steady and patient, like a mountain that weathers every storm without moving. And despite her best efforts to maintain distance, Margaret found herself looking forward to their brief conversations, to the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, to the sound of his laugh when she said something that amused him. 6 weeks after her arrival in Twin Falls, on a warm September evening, Russell asked her to go riding with him. They were standing outside the general store, where Margaret had been purchasing supplies for the schoolhouse. Russell had been loading feed onto his wagon and had offered to carry her packages back to the boarding house. "There's a beautiful spot about 3 miles out of town," he said, his tone casual but his eyes hopeful. "A creek runs through it, and there are cottonwood trees that are just starting to turn gold. I thought you might enjoy seeing some of the country, since you've been cooped up in town since you arrived." Margaret's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain the safe distance she'd tried so hard to preserve. But something in her rebelled against that constant caution. She was so tired of being afraid, of running, of never allowing herself a moment of genuine connection. "I don't have a horse," she said, and realized as soon as the words left her mouth that she'd essentially accepted. Russell's face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip. "I have a gentle mare that would be perfect for you. She's steady as a rock, won't give you any trouble. We could go Sunday afternoon after church, if that suits you." Margaret nodded before she could talk herself out of it. "All right, Sunday afternoon." She spent the next few days alternating between excitement and anxiety about the outing. Part of her whispered that this was a mistake, that getting closer to Russell was dangerous. But another part, A part she'd thought Vincent Carlyle and her father had killed, yearned for this simple pleasure, this normal experience of a man and a woman getting to know each other. Sunday arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures. After church, Margaret changed into her most practical dress and met Russell at the livery stable. The mare he'd brought for her was indeed gentle, a pretty chestnut with a white blaze and kind eyes. "Her name is Daisy," Russell said as he helped Margaret into the saddle. His hands on her waist were brief and respectful, but Margaret felt the warmth of them long after he'd stepped away. They rode out of town at an easy pace, and Margaret found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the horse's gait. She'd learned to ride as a girl, before her mother died and everything changed, and the skill came back to her naturally. The landscape around Twin Falls was stark but beautiful in its own way. All rolling hills and scattered sage, with the Snake River Canyon visible in the distance as a dramatic slash across the earth. Russell pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area, and Margaret found herself genuinely interested, asking questions and laughing at his anecdotes. When they reached the creek, Margaret understood why Russell had wanted to share this place. It was an oasis in the dry landscape, with tall cottonwoods providing shade and the sound of water running over smooth stones creating a peaceful melody. The leaves were indeed turning gold, rustling in the light breeze. They dismounted, and Russell spread a blanket near the water's edge. He'd brought apples and cheese and fresh bread from Mrs. Pemberton's kitchen, and they ate while watching the play of sunlight on the water. "This is lovely," Margaret said softly. "Thank you for bringing me here." Russell was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was serious. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" The use of her first name sent a thrill through her, intimate and frightening at once. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "What are you running from?" Margaret's blood went cold. She started to stand, to flee, but Russell reached out and gently caught her hand. "Wait, please. I'm not trying to pry into something that's none of my business. I just want you to know that whatever it is, whatever happened back east, it doesn't matter to me. Everyone who comes west is running from something or towards something, usually both. I don't need to know your secrets. I just want you to know that you're safe here. You're safe with me." Margaret felt tears welling up, threatening to spill over. No one had said anything like that to her in so long, maybe ever. The kindness in Russell's voice, the understanding in his eyes, it was almost too much to bear. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't talk about it. If you knew, you wouldn't want anything to do with me." Russell moved closer, still holding her hand gently. "I doubt that very much, but I meant what I said. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. I just want to know you, Margaret. The woman you are now, here in Twin Falls. That's enough for me." A tear escaped and rolled down her cheek. Russell reached up and gently wiped it away with his thumb, and the tenderness of the gesture broke something open inside her chest. "I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid that if I let myself care about anyone, if I let anyone get close, everything will fall apart again." "Life doesn't come with guarantees," Russell said softly. "But I can promise you this. I will never hurt you on purpose. I will never betray your trust. And if you give me a chance, I will spend every day trying to be worthy of whatever piece of yourself you're willing to share with me." Margaret looked into his eyes and saw nothing but honesty there, nothing but genuine care and affection. And in that moment, she made a choice. She could continue to live in fear, always running, always hiding, never allowing herself to feel anything real. Or she could take a risk, could open her heart just enough to let this good man in and see what might grow from that small act of courage. She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and tentative, a question and an answer all at once. Russell responded carefully, not pushing, just meeting her where she was, his hand coming up to cup her face with infinite gentleness. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Russell rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the day I met you," he admitted. Margaret laughed, surprised by the joy that bubbled up inside her. "Me too, though I wouldn't let myself acknowledge it." They spent the rest of the afternoon by the creek, talking, and sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. Margaret didn't tell him about her past, wasn't ready for that yet, but she told him about her present, about her love of teaching, about the small satisfactions of building a life in Twin Falls. Russell told her more about his ranch, about his dreams of expanding it someday, of building a real home instead of the simple cabin he lived in now. As the sun began to set and they rode back toward town, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Maybe she could have this. Maybe she could have happiness, a future, someone to care for who cared for her in return. Maybe her past didn't have to define her forever. The relationship between Margaret and Russell deepened over the following weeks. They were courting. Everyone in town could see it, and Margaret found that she liked the feeling of being courted properly, with respect and genuine affection. Russell took her on picnics and to town dances. He brought her flowers from the prairie and books he ordered specially from Boise. Having paid attention to her mentioned interests in literature and poetry. Margaret met Russell's ranch hands, Chuck and Pete, two grizzled cowboys in their 50s who treated her with courtly respect and teased Russell mercilessly about being smitten. She saw the Double R Ranch and understood why Russell was so proud of it. He'd built something real and lasting, carving a life out of harsh land through sheer determination and hard work. One evening in late October, as they sat on the porch of the boarding house watching the stars come out, Russell took her hand and said, "I love you, Margaret. I know it hasn't been that long, but I'm sure of my feelings. You don't have to say anything back, I just needed you to know." Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. She wanted to say it back, felt it back, but the words stuck. Saying those words meant vulnerability, meant risk, meant trusting that this happiness wouldn't be snatched away. Russell seemed to understand. He squeezed her hand gently and said, "It's all right. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." But fate, it seemed, had other plans. 2 days later, Margaret was leaving the schoolhouse after a long day when a man stepped out of the shadows near the building. She gasped in shock and fear, her mind immediately jumping to Vincent Carlisle, to her father, to all the horrors she'd fled. But it wasn't either of them. It was a stranger, a rough-looking man with cold eyes and a sneer on his face. "You're a hard woman to track down, Margaret Louise," he said, and her blood ran cold at the sound of her full name spoken with such familiarity. "I don't know you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "No, but I know you. Or rather, I know your father, Thomas Louise. He hired me to find you, bring you back to Philadelphia. Seems he survived that knock on the head you gave him, though it took him a while to recover. He's still got debts to pay, and you're still his solution to that problem. Vincent Carlisle is willing to double his original offer if I can deliver you back within the month." Margaret felt the world tilting beneath her feet. This couldn't be happening. She'd come so far, built so much. "I'm not going back," she said, and was proud that her voice didn't shake. The man laughed, harsh and ugly. "That's not really up to you, sweetheart. I'm a bounty hunter and I've been paid to bring you back. You can come peaceful-like, or I can make it hard on you. Your choice." Before Margaret could respond, another voice cut through the evening air. "I think the lady made her choice clear." Russell stepped out from around the corner of the schoolhouse, and Margaret had never been so glad to see anyone in her life. He must have been coming to walk her home, as he often did when he was in town. The bounty hunter sized Russell up with a calculating look. "This ain't your business, Cowboy. This is between me and the lady. Anything involving Miss Louise is my business, Russell said calmly, but there was steel in his voice. And she said she's not going with you. So I suggest you get on your horse and ride out of Twin Falls before there's trouble. The bounty hunter's hand moved toward his gun, and Margaret's heart stopped. But Russell was faster, his own weapon drawn and aimed before the other man had cleared leather. "Don't be stupid," Russell said quietly. "I don't want to shoot you, but I will if you threaten her. There are witnesses." He nodded toward the street, where several townspeople had noticed the confrontation and were watching with interest. The bounty hunter raised his hands slowly, his face twisted with frustration. "This isn't over. I'll be back with the law. She's a wanted woman, assaulted her own father and robbed him blind." "Then we'll deal with the law when it comes," Russell said. "But for now, you're leaving." The man backed away slowly, then turned and strode toward the livery stable. Russell didn't lower his gun until the man had disappeared from sight. Then he turned to Margaret with concern written all over his face. "Are you all right?" Margaret was shaking, the adrenaline finally catching up with her. "Russell, I'm so sorry. I should have told you, should have warned you. He's right, I did hit my father and I did take his money, and now I've dragged you into this mess." Russell holstered his gun and pulled her into his arms, holding her while she trembled. "Shh, it's all right. We'll figure this out, but first I need you to tell me everything. I can't help you if I don't know what we're dealing with." That night in Mrs. Pemberton's parlor, with the kind landlady serving tea and acting as both witness and support, Margaret told Russell everything. She told him about her father's gambling addiction, about the mounting debts, about Vincent Carlisle's cruel proposal that was essentially purchasing her like property. She told him about being locked in her room, about the desperation that had driven her to violence, about the money she'd taken that wasn't legally hers, but which she'd needed to survive. Russell listened without interruption, his face growing darker as the story unfolded. When she finished, drained and exhausted from reliving those awful memories, he reached across and took both of her hands in his. "That man, your father, he had no right," Russell said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "No right to treat you that way, to try to sell you to settle his debts. And this Carlisle character, he's no better. What you did wasn't a crime, Margaret, it was survival." "But the law might not see it that way," Margaret said miserably. "My father has connections back east. He could make things very difficult." Mrs. Pemberton, who had been listening with increasing distress, spoke up. "We won't let them take you back, dear. Twin Falls takes care of its own." Russell nodded firmly. "She's right. First thing tomorrow, I'm talking to Marshal Davies. He's a good man, fair-minded. We'll explain the situation, get ahead of this before that bounty hunter comes back with some fabricated warrant." The next morning, Russell, Margaret, and Mrs. Pemberton met with Marshal Davies in his small office. The marshal was in his late 40s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened to Margaret's story with increasing concern. "That's a hell of a situation, Miss Louise," he said when she finished. "And I want to be clear with you, I believe you. I've seen enough of the world to know that men like your father and this Carlisle exist, and they're capable of exactly what you described. But the law can be complicated, especially when it crosses state lines and territories." Margaret felt her hope sinking, but the marshal held up a hand. "However," he continued, "Idaho territory has its own laws and its own courts. If this bounty hunter comes back claiming you're wanted for assault and theft in Pennsylvania, we'll demand to see proper documentation. And even if he has it, which I doubt, we can fight extradition. It'll take time and legal maneuvering, but you've got rights here that you might not have had back east." "What can we do to help?" Russell asked. "Get her a lawyer for one thing," the marshal said. There's a good one in Boise, Samuel Morton. He handles cases involving women fleeing bad situations, got a real passion for it. I'll send him a telegram today, explain the basics. Meanwhile, Miss Louise, I'd suggest you stay close to town, stay visible, and for God's sake, stay safe. If that bounty hunter is willing to operate in the gray areas of the law, he might try something less official. Margaret nodded, feeling both grateful and terrified. Thank you, Marshal. Over the next week, the town of Twin Falls rallied around Margaret in a way that brought tears to her eyes. Parents of her students wrote letters attesting to her good character. Mrs. Pemberton and several other townswomen organized a legal defense fund. The town council formally hired her as the schoolteacher with a proper contract, establishing her as a respected member of the community. And Russell barely left her side. He arranged for Chuck, one of his ranch hands, to manage the double R while he stayed in town, ostensibly to handle business but really to keep Margaret safe. He walked her to and from the schoolhouse every day, stayed for meals at the boarding house, and made it clear to everyone that Margaret had his full support and protection. The lawyer, Samuel Morton, arrived from Boise 10 days after the bounty hunter's first appearance. He was a serious man in his early 50s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and an air of quiet competence. After meeting with Margaret and reviewing her situation, he was cautiously optimistic. The good news is that your father hasn't actually filed any official charges, Morton explained. I've sent inquiries to Philadelphia, and there's no warrant for your arrest. This bounty hunter is likely working on a private contract, which means he has no legal authority to compel you to return. Margaret felt a wave of relief so intense she nearly sobbed. So I'm safe. For now, Morton cautioned. But your father could still file charges, and he could still pursue this through legal channels. What I'd recommend is filing a preemptive claim. We can go to the territorial court and document the situation you fled from, the coercion and threat to your safety. We can establish your residency here in Idaho territory and make a legal case for why you shouldn't be forced to return to Pennsylvania. It's not foolproof, but it creates a much stronger defense. Do it, Russell said immediately. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. Margaret looked at him with gratitude and something deeper, something that felt suspiciously like love fully realized. Russell, I can't ask you to pay for this. You're not asking. I'm offering. He reached over and took her hand, not caring that Morton and the marshal were watching. Margaret, I meant what I said. I love you, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you're safe and free to live your life as you choose. 2 days later, the bounty hunter returned, and this time he had a companion, another rough-looking character who seemed even less savory than the first. They confronted Margaret as she was leaving the general store, Russell at her side. Miss Louise, we have a proposition for you, the first bounty hunter said, his tone falsely pleasant. Your father is willing to negotiate. He'll drop all potential charges and call off the search if you agree to return the money you took, plus interest. Call it $1,200, and you're free and clear. Margaret's heart sank. $1,200 might as well be $12,000. She'd spent most of what she'd taken on her journey west and establishing herself here. Even with her teacher's salary, it would take years to save that much. She doesn't have that kind of money, Russell said flatly. The bounty hunter shrugged. Then I guess we'll have to pursue other options. Be a shame if something happened to that nice little schoolhouse, or if word got around about the new teacher's criminal past. Small towns like this, they can turn on a person pretty quick once they know the truth. It was a threat, barely veiled, and Margaret felt sick with fear and anger. But before she could respond, Russell stepped forward, his entire demeanor radiating controlled fury. Are you threatening Miss Louise? Because if you are, you're going to have a problem not just with me, but with every person in this town. You've been asking questions, making trouble, and folks here don't appreciate it. Now I'm going to make you a counter-offer. You ride out of Twin Falls today. Report back to Thomas Louise that his daughter is safe and settled and beyond his reach, and we'll forget this whole ugly business. Otherwise, I'll have Marshal Davies run you both out of town on charges of harassment and intimidation. The second bounty hunter, who had been silent until now, spoke up. That's a lot of talk, Cowboy. You got the money to back it up. Russell didn't hesitate. If it's money you want, then let's make this a business transaction. I'll give you $1,500 to report back that you couldn't find Margaret Louise, that the trail went cold in St. Louis. Her father gets nothing, and you get paid more than he was offering. Seems like a good deal for everyone except a man who doesn't deserve consideration anyway. Margaret gasped. Russell, no, that's too much. I can't let you do that. But Russell kept his eyes on the bounty hunters, and Margaret could see the calculation in their faces. They were mercenaries, motivated by profit, not loyalty. After a long moment, the first bounty hunter nodded slowly. Make it 2,000 and you've got a deal. Man's got to make it worth his while to lose a client. 1,500 is my offer, Russell said firmly. Take it or leave it. The two men exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, the first one nodded. All right. 1,500, cash, and we disappear. Thomas Louise will get word his daughter is lost to him. Russell nodded. Meet me at the bank in 1 hour. Marshal Davies will witness the transaction, and you'll sign a statement saying you've concluded your search unsuccessfully. Then you leave Twin Falls and don't come back. An hour later, the transaction was complete. Margaret watched in a daze as Russell counted out bills, an astronomical sum that represented years of hard work and careful saving. The bounty hunters signed the document Morton had prepared, witnessed by the marshal and the bank manager, then mounted their horses and rode out of town without a backward glance. When they were gone, Margaret turned to Russell with tears streaming down her face. Why would you do that? That's your future, your savings. You are going to expand the ranch, build a real house. Russell cupped her face in his hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. You are my future, Margaret. Houses and cattle and land, those things don't mean anything if I can't share them with you. That money bought your freedom, your safety, your chance at happiness. That's worth everything to me. But I can't pay you back, not for years, maybe not ever. I don't want you to pay me back. Russell's eyes were intense, full of emotion. Margaret, I want to marry you. I want you to be my wife, to build a life together, to share everything, the good and the bad. If you'll have me. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Marriage had been a terrifying concept, something her father had tried to force on her, a prison she'd escaped. But this was different. This was Russell, who had proven his care and respect over and over, who had literally bought her freedom with no expectation of return. This was a choice, her choice, made freely and without coercion. Yes, she whispered, then louder with more certainty. Yes, I'll marry you. Russell pulled her into his arms and kissed her, deep and full of promise, and Margaret felt the last of her fears begin to dissolve. She was still damaged, still healing, but for the first time since that awful night in Philadelphia, she believed she might actually be all right. More than all right. She might actually be happy. They married 3 weeks later in the small church at the end of Twin Falls Main Street. Margaret wore a dress that Miss Clara had sewn for her, simple but beautiful with lace at the collar and cuffs. Mrs. Pemberton cried through the entire ceremony. Marshal Davies stood up as Russell's best man, and half the town attended the celebration afterward. Margaret moved out to the Double R Ranch after the wedding, and despite her initial worries about leaving town, she found that she loved the space and quiet of ranch life. Russell had been right. The cabin was small but well built, cozy rather than cramped. He promised to build her a proper house when finances allowed, but Margaret assured him she was happy with what they had. She continued teaching, riding into town 3 days a week while Russell or one of the ranch hands accompanied her. The other 2 days, she held classes in the cabin for the children of neighboring ranches, a small group of 4 students whose parents were grateful not to have to make the long trip into town. The winter of 1882 was hard, with heavy snows and bitter cold, but Margaret discovered that hardship was different when you faced it with someone who loved you. She and Russell grew closer through those long winter months, learning each other's rhythms, building a partnership based on mutual respect and deepening affection. Margaret still had nightmares sometimes, waking in the dark with her heart racing, trapped again in that locked room in Philadelphia. But Russell was always there, pulling her close, reminding her that she was safe, that he had her, that no one would ever hurt her again. Gradually, the nightmares became less frequent. In February, Lawyer Morton sent word that he'd filed all the necessary documents with the territorial court. Margaret's residency was established, her situation documented, and a protective order had been issued preventing her father from making any legal claims against her in Idaho territory. Thomas Louise could still cause trouble if she ever returned to Pennsylvania, but as long as she stayed west, she was legally protected. "It's really over," Margaret said that evening, reading and rereading Morton's letter. "I'm free." Russell pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "You've been free since the day you stepped off that stagecoach in Twin Falls, but I'm glad the law finally caught up with that truth." Spring came late but welcome, and Margaret threw herself into both teaching and ranch life. She learned to keep chickens, started a vegetable garden, and discovered she had a knack for working with the horses. Russell taught her to really ride, not just the sedate pace she'd used in Philadelphia, but true riding, fast and free across the open range. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Russell said, "I've been thinking about expanding the herd. With cattle prices the way they are, we could really grow the operation. But that would mean hiring another hand or two, which cuts into profits in the short term." Margaret smiled, recognizing the question he wasn't quite asking. "I think we should do it. Build for the future, not just maintain what we have." "It would delay building a bigger house," Russell cautioned. "I don't need a bigger house, at least not yet," Margaret said, then paused, gathering her courage. "Though in a few months, we might need to think about adding a room." Russell looked at her, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning understanding to pure joy. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Margaret nodded, unable to contain her smile. "I'm pretty sure I'm with child. It's early yet, but all the signs are there." Russell let out a whoop of joy and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with tears. "We're going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "Margaret, that's the best news you could have given me." That night, they talked late into the evening about their future, about names and cradles and all the changes a child would bring. Margaret felt a peace settle over her that she'd never experienced before. She was going to be a mother, and she was determined to be nothing like her own father had been. This child would grow up knowing love and security, would never be used as a pawn in someone else's schemes. Margaret continued teaching through the summer, though she had to tell the school board about her pregnancy and assure them she could continue at least until the baby came. The community was supportive, with several of the mothers offering advice and hand-me-down baby items. In August, Margaret felt the baby quicken for the first time, a flutter of movement that brought tears to her eyes. Russell insisted on talking to the baby every night, telling stories and singing songs that were often comically off-key, but filled with love. On a cold November morning in 1883, Margaret went into labor. Russell rode like hell to fetch Mrs. Pemberton and Doc Morrison, the town physician. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Margaret was sure she wouldn't survive. But Russell was there the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her brow, telling her she was strong and brave and could do this. Finally, as dawn broke on a new day, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that made everyone in the room laugh with relief. He was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and his father's gray-blue eyes. "What should we name him?" Russell asked, his voice choked with emotion as he held his son for the first time. Margaret thought for a moment. She wanted a name that represented hope and new beginnings, a name untainted by her past. "What about William? We could call him Will." Russell smiled. "William Grant, I like it. Welcome to the world, Will." The early months of motherhood were exhausting but rewarding. Margaret had to take a temporary leave from teaching, but she found that she loved being home with her son, watching him grow and change every day. Russell was a devoted father, taking Will out to the barn to see the horses, narrating his ranch work as if his infant son understood every word. When Will was 6 months old, Margaret returned to teaching part-time, with Mrs. Pemberton coming out to the ranch twice a week to watch the baby. It was a good arrangement, allowing Margaret to maintain the work she loved while still being present for her son. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Russell's gamble on expanding the herd paid off, and by the end of 1884, the Double R was one of the most successful cattle operations in the area. They hired 2 more hands, and Russell finally started building the larger house he'd promised Margaret. It was completed in the spring of 1885, a beautiful 2-story structure with a proper parlor, a spacious kitchen, 3 bedrooms, and a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Margaret cried when she saw it finished, overwhelmed by how far she'd come from that terrified young woman who'd arrived in Twin Falls nearly 3 years earlier. Will was walking by then, a sturdy toddler who followed his father everywhere and showed signs of having inherited Russell's easy temperament and Margaret's sharp mind. Watching her husband and son together, Margaret often had to pinch herself to believe this life was real. In the fall of 1885, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their daughter was born in early May of 1886, a beautiful little girl with auburn hair like her mother and her father's smile. They named her Caroline Louise Grant, honoring Margaret's mother, who had been kind and loving before her early death. Caroline, called Carrie by everyone in the family, was a quiet baby, content to observe the world around her with serious eyes. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch thrived, becoming one of the largest operations in southern Idaho territory. Margaret eventually left teaching to focus on her growing family, though she continued to tutor students privately and maintained her connection to education. Russell became a respected voice in territorial politics, advocating for statehood and better protections for property rights. In 1889, Russell was asked to run for the territorial legislature. He was hesitant at first, worried about the time it would take away from the ranch and family, but Margaret encouraged him. "You have good ideas and a fair mind," she told him. "You could do a lot of good for this territory." He won the election by a comfortable margin and served 2 terms, though he chose not to run for a third, wanting to focus on family as their children grew older. By then, they had 4 children, with another son, James, born in 1888, and a second daughter, Emma, arriving in 1891. The children grew up surrounded by love and security, never knowing want or fear. Margaret made sure they knew the value of education and hard work, while Russell taught them about integrity and fairness. She never told them the full story of her past, though as they got older, she shared carefully edited versions that conveyed the importance of making your own choices and standing up for yourself. Will grew into a fine young man, taking after his father in his love of ranching and his easy way with animals and people. He married at 22, a sweet girl named Sarah from a neighboring ranch, and eventually took over the day-to-day operations of the Double R. Carrie inherited her mother's love of learning and became a teacher herself, opening a school in a growing community 20 miles north of Twin Falls. She married a lawyer from Boise, a good man who reminded Margaret powerfully of Samuel Morton. James showed an early aptitude for business and eventually moved to Boise to work in banking and finance, though he visited the ranch often. Emma was the artist of the family, with a talent for painting that led her to study in San Francisco before returning to Idaho to open a studio. Through it all, Margaret and Russell's love deepened and matured. They had their disagreements, their hard times, their moments of frustration and worry. But they faced everything together, with the unshakable foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection that had drawn them together in the first place. On their 20th wedding anniversary, in 1903, Russell took Margaret back to the creek where he'd first told her he loved her. The cottonwoods were as beautiful as she remembered, their leaves golden in the autumn sunlight. "You ever regret it?" Russell asked as they sat on the same spot where he'd spread a blanket 2 decades earlier. "Leaving everything behind, coming west, building this life." Margaret thought about the question seriously. She thought about the girl she'd been, terrified and desperate. She thought about the woman she'd become, strong and confident and loved. She thought about her children, her husband, the life they'd built together. "Not for a single moment," she said softly. "Coming west, meeting you, everything that followed, it's been the greatest adventure of my life. You gave me something I'd never had before, the freedom to choose my own future. And I choose this, Russell. Every single day, I choose this life we've built together." Russell pulled her close and kissed her, and Margaret felt the same flutter of joy she'd experienced at 17, 23, 30, and now 44. Love, she discovered, didn't diminish with time. It transformed, deepened, became something richer and more complex than the initial spark of attraction. They talked about their children, their grandchildren, beginning to arrive as Will and Sarah started their own family. They talked about the future, about Idaho's impending statehood, about the changes coming to the West as the new century unfolded. But mostly, they just enjoyed being together, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from that connection. As they rode back to the ranch that evening, Margaret looked at the land stretching out around them, at the house they'd built, at the life they'd created together. She thought about the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach in Twin Falls 21 years ago, carrying nothing but a carpet bag and a heart full of fear. That woman was still a part of her, but she'd been transformed by love, by safety, by the simple opportunity to become who she was meant to be. Russell hadn't saved her. She'd saved herself by having the courage to run, to start over, to take a chance on something better. But he had walked beside her every step of the way after that, supporting and loving and believing in her even when she struggled to believe in herself. The years continued to pass, bringing their share of joys and sorrows. They lost Mrs. Pemberton in 1905, a woman who had been like a mother to Margaret. They celebrated as Idaho achieved statehood in 1890, vindicating Russell's years of political work. They welcomed more grandchildren, eventually counting 12 in total, a boisterous, loving crowd that filled the big house with noise and laughter during holidays. In 1910, Margaret received a letter that made her hands shake. It was from a lawyer in Philadelphia, informing her that Thomas Louise had died, and despite their estrangement, she was named in his will. The letter included a brief note her father had written shortly before his death. Margaret almost threw it away unread, but Russell encouraged her to at least see what it said. With trembling hands, she unfolded the yellowed paper and read, "Margaret, if you ever read this, know that I regret everything. The gambling, the debts, the way I treated you after your mother died. I was weak and selfish, and I destroyed the one good thing I had left. I don't expect forgiveness, don't deserve it, but I want you to know that every day for the past 30 years, I've thought about you and hoped you found the happiness I couldn't give you. Whatever money is left after my debts are settled is yours. It's a pittance compared to what I owe you, but it's all I have to offer. Your father, Thomas." Margaret cried after reading it, not for the man her father had been, but for the man he might have been if he'd found the strength to change earlier. There wasn't much money, perhaps $300 after the debts were settled, but she donated it to the school in Twin Falls in memory of her mother. By 1915, Russell and Margaret were in their 60s, slowing down but still active. They'd handed over the ranch operations to Will years earlier, but they still lived in the big house, surrounded by family. Margaret's hair had gone silver, and Russell's face was deeply lined from decades in the sun. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had fallen in love beside a creek under golden cottonwoods. On a warm summer evening in 1917, their entire family gathered for a celebration of Russell and Margaret's 35th wedding anniversary. The house and yard were full of children and grandchildren, laughter and love filling every corner. Will stood up to make a toast, his voice carrying over the crowd. "To my parents, who taught us all what love really means, not just the easy romance of youth, but the hard, daily choice to love someone through everything life throws at you. You've built something remarkable, not just this ranch, but this family, this legacy of love and respect and genuine partnership. Thank you for showing us the way." Everyone raised their glasses, and Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She looked around at all these beautiful faces, these people who existed because she'd had the courage to run, to choose herself, to take a chance on love when it was offered. Russell squeezed her hand, and she looked up at him. "Happy anniversary, Margaret Grant," he said softly. "Happy anniversary, Russell," she replied. "Thank you for giving me this life." "We gave it to each other," he corrected gently. "That's how it works when two people truly love each other. They build something together that neither could have created alone." As the party continued around them, Margaret reflected on the incredible journey her life had been. From desperate flight to unexpected love to a full, rich life surrounded by family, she traveled further than the miles between Philadelphia and Twin Falls could measure. She'd healed from wounds that had once seemed fatal. She'd learned to trust again, to love again, to believe in the possibility of happiness. The past would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her. She was Margaret Grant, wife, mother, grandmother, teacher, rancher, friend. She was a woman who had taken her fate into her own hands and shaped it into something beautiful. She was loved and she loved in return, and that was the greatest victory of all. As the sun set over the Idaho landscape she'd come to love so deeply, Margaret leaned against Russell's shoulder and felt complete contentment wash over her. This was home. This was family. This was love. And it was everything she'd never dared to dream of when she'd fled Philadelphia all those years ago. The future stretched before them, uncertain as always, but faced together, hand in hand, heart to heart, as they'd done for 35 years and would continue to do for whatever time they had left. And that was more than enough. That was everything. Years later, in 1925, Margaret and Russell celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. They were both in their 80s by then, slower and frailer but still sharp-minded and devoted to each other. The celebration was smaller than their 35th, held in the parlor of the big house with just immediate family. But it was no less meaningful. Their children spoke about the example their parents had set, about the love and stability that had shaped their own approaches to marriage and family. Their grandchildren, some now adults with children of their own, shared memories and stories that made everyone laugh and cry. Margaret held Russell's hand throughout the celebration, grateful for every moment they'd been given. They'd built something that would last far beyond their own lives, a legacy of love and courage and the simple truth that it's never too late to start over, to choose happiness, to build the life you deserve. When everyone had finally gone home and the house was quiet again, Russell and Margaret sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the evening chill. 50 years, Russell said wonderingly. Seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. Margaret smiled. I was just thinking the same thing. Do you remember the day we met? You stepped off that stagecoach looking terrified and determined all at once, Russell said. I thought you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I remember thinking you looked too good to be true, Margaret admitted. Too kind, too steady. I was sure you'd turn out to be hiding something. Russell laughed softly. And what did I turn out to be hiding? Nothing, Margaret said. You were exactly who you appeared to be, which was the most shocking thing of all, a genuinely good man. I'm not perfect, Margaret. Never have been. No, but you're perfect for me. You always have been. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out over the ranch land that had been their home for half a century. In the distance, they could hear the lowing of cattle and the soft nicker of horses in the barn. The sounds of their life, the life they'd built together. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the gentle rise and fall of her husband's breathing beside her. She thought about the long road that had brought her here, from desperation to safety, from fear to love, from merely surviving to truly living. Every choice, every risk, every moment of courage had led to this. A life well lived, surrounded by love, filled with purpose and meaning. She'd traveled west to escape her past, running from violence and coercion, and a future she couldn't bear. She'd found sanctuary in Twin Falls, found work that fulfilled her, found a community that accepted her. But most importantly, she'd found Russell, a cowboy with a kind heart and patient love, who had given her not just safety but partnership, not just shelter but a home, not just survival but a beautiful future. And what a future it had been. Filled with children and grandchildren, with hard work and honest living, with setbacks overcome and triumphs celebrated. It hadn't always been easy, but it had always been theirs, built together through commitment and care and genuine love. As Margaret drifted off to sleep there on the porch, Russell's hand still holding hers, she felt at peace. She'd lived a full life, loved deeply and been loved in return, made her mark on the world through her children and their children. She'd taken the broken pieces of her young self and crafted them into something whole and strong and beautiful. The girl who'd fled Philadelphia in terror would hardly recognize the woman she'd become. But Margaret liked to think that girl would be proud, would understand that the courage to run was just the first step. The real bravery had been in staying, in trusting, in opening her wounded heart to the possibility of love. Russell had met her in that vulnerable place and treated it with the respect and care it deserved. He'd loved her not despite her brokenness, but through it, giving her space to heal while always being present, always being steady, always being the foundation she could build upon. That was the gift he'd given her. Not salvation, but partnership. Not rescue, but respect. Not a life handed to her, but the tools and support to build one herself. And together, they'd created something far greater than either could have imagined. As the years wound down and their story moved toward its natural conclusion, Margaret and Russell spent their final years surrounded by family and filled with gratitude. They'd lived long lives, good lives, lives that mattered. They'd loved each other through youth and middle age into their golden years, and that love never wavered, never diminished, only deepened and grew richer with each passing year. When Russell passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1926 at the age of 83, Margaret mourned him deeply, but without regret. They'd had 44 years together, far more than many people were given, and they'd made the most of every single day. She missed him terribly, but she also felt his presence in every corner of their home, in every memory they'd created together. Margaret lived another 3 years, passing away quietly in 1929 at the age of 87. Her children and grandchildren gathered around her bedside, and her final words were a whisper only Will, leaning close, could hear. "Tell your father I'm coming home." They buried Margaret beside Russell on a hillside overlooking the Double R Ranch, with a simple stone that read, "Margaret Louise Grant, 1859–1929, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She found freedom and love in the West." The ranch continued under Will's management and eventually passed to his sons, remaining in the Grant family for generations. The big house Russell built remained the heart of the operation, filled with new families, new children, new love stories, all building on the foundation Margaret and Russell had laid. The schoolhouse in Twin Falls where Margaret had taught eventually became a historical landmark, with a plaque commemorating her contribution to education in early Idaho. Her great-great-grandchildren would eventually visit it on school field trips, learning about the remarkable woman who traveled west alone and afraid and built a legacy of courage and love. Margaret's story became family legend, passed down through generations. The details softened over time, the pain of her early life fading while the triumph of her later years remained bright. She became an example to her descendants of resilience, of the courage to start over, of the transformative power of love and partnership. But at its core, the story remained simple. A young woman fleeing her past met a good man who offered her a future, and together they built something beautiful. It was a story as old as the West itself, but no less powerful for its familiarity. It was a story of survival and redemption, of second chances and hard-won happiness. Margaret's journey from Philadelphia to Twin Falls, from terror to peace, from isolation to love, represented everything the West promised to those brave enough to seek it. Transformation, opportunity, the chance to become who you were truly meant to be. She'd seized that chance with both hands and never let go, building a life of meaning and purpose from the ashes of her former existence. And in the end, that was her greatest legacy. Not the ranch or the children or the material success, but the simple proof that it's never too late to start over, that courage can be found in the darkest moments, and that love, real love, can heal even the deepest wounds. She traveled west to escape her past, and found, with Russell's help, a beautiful future that exceeded her wildest dreams. The sun set over the Idaho landscape, casting long shadows across the land where Margaret and Russell had lived and loved and built their empire. The Double R Ranch stood as testament to their hard work and vision, while the generations of family they'd created carried forward their values of integrity, kindness, and the courage to choose love even when it feels risky. Margaret Louise had boarded that stagecoach in 1882 with nothing but fear and determination. She'd stepped off it in Twin Falls carrying the weight of trauma and secrets. But she'd met Russell Grant, a cowboy with understanding eyes and a patient heart, and he'd shown her what real partnership looked like. Together, they'd created a beautiful future, and that future continued to unfold long after they were gone, touching lives and shaping destinies for generations to come. It was a love story for the ages, played out against the backdrop of the American West, a testament to the power of second chances and the redemptive nature of true love. And though Margaret and Russell were gone, their story lived on, inspiring their descendants and reminding everyone who heard it that no matter how dark your past, there's always hope for a brighter future if you're brave enough to reach for it.